Okay, so for a source analysis, which is one style of essay for the diploma for high school social studies, source analysis means anything like it can be a quote. I have this lovely gentleman's face attached to the quote as well. His name is Herbie Hancock. It can be an image, so a political cartoon. We looked at some in our notes. It could be a graph. It could be a chart. It can be anything. Your source is just an image or a quote, something that you have to read, analyze, and respond to. So if you do get a quote, which is likely, especially like on your diplomas, which you all write, you're often going to have a quote. And the first thing you want to do is take a quick read of the source. And then you want to identify any words that you don't know the meaning of and define them. So take a second, you should have read this by now. Just underline any words you don't know what he's talking about. You don't know what the word means. In addition to that, I was watching a video from a teacher down in Wetaskiwin. He also mentioned that you should also highlight key terms. What are the key terms here? What are the main ideas that we're talking about? Okay, so I'm going to pause the video for a second. I'm going to give you a moment to think. Okay, so would anyone like to highlight a word that they thought was a key word? It's important to the quote and understanding the source. Back there, I'm not going to say your names on the recording, just so you're protected. Back there. Globalization. Excellent, right? That's the whole course. I think you had your hand up second. Right here. Was that the same word? Yeah, it was just. Okay. Anyone else? Any other key words that help you to understand the perspective or what this person's trying to communicate? In the middle? Yeah.
Like re-examine.
Re-examine. Excellent, right?
Maybe even just like the last sentence in general.
Yeah, that's not comfortable for the average person. I would say that kind of covers our main bases. Okay, so those are key words, and they're going to help us to focus on how to respond to the assignment, to this quote. So take a moment here. When you start your source analysis, grade 10s, the first thing you have to do always is explain the information in the source. So that could include, let's say if it's a quote, interpreting. What is he trying to say here? But generally speaking, with the source, if it's an image, what do you think it's trying to communicate? So I'm going to remove these lines from my document because I don't need them. And again, grade 10s, you don't need to be very fancy about this. You can just start with this source is attempting to communicate that ... So feel free to start it that way. I will tell you this, obviously, teachers will vary, but generally speaking, I would rather, and I think many teachers would agree, we would rather that you address the assignment appropriately and effectively rather than trying to sound smart or clever or like, oh, I better go to thesaurus and use a bigger word. Like, what's a synonym for attempting? You don't need to do that. Just focus on conveying your information. There's another section later on that I'll explain that with, okay? Okay, so would anyone like to share their happening in the source? Roughly speaking, what is Herbie Hancock trying to tell us? Any takers? At the back?
Say like our healthcare is different than theirs. It could be difficult to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Different traditions, so it could be difficult.
So just take a look at the board. So it is difficult to change. It is difficult to change. I'll make a bridge there later, but it's difficult for people to change. It's difficult for people to understand different traditions and adapt and adjust. I feel like that's kind of the gist of what you're trying to say, which is great. right? Did anyone else have a different interpretation? Did anyone else word it differently? So you can add that to your response as well. So this first sentence, globalization means we have to re-examine some of our ideas. Maybe later on in the source, we can look at that in step 3. But I want you to start thinking about whether or not you agree with this person's interpretation of globalization. Okay. So this source is attempting to communicate that it is difficult for people to change, for people to understand different traditions and adapt and adjust. Why do you think it's difficult? Does he give you any reasons? Can you infer a reason? There's a key word in the last sentence. We identified the last sentence as key. Or like 2 words, yes. Yeah. Globalization is an uncomfortable process. Do you think that Herbie Hancock is trying to tell us that globalization is an uncomfortable process? Okay. So this point is going to be useful. I'll put some stars here because you can use that later on for your critical thinking bit, your evidence portion of your response. What else? What else is Herbie Hancock trying to communicate here? It's kind of in the middle. There's an idea there that in the middle that he's trying to tell us about globalization. Okay, so after we look at that first sentence, right here.
Opening up to like other countries and ideas can benefit us.
Yeah. So we must open ourselves up to other, what does he specify? Cultures and ideas. This is all great. I'm going to highlight this one as well. So now I'm going to go down here and I'm going to give you an example of how I might combine these ideas in a response. So I'm just going to stop the recording or pause the recording so I can just type and not have dead space. Okay, I'm recording again. So yeah, this is just an idea of what could be written. This source is communicating that globalization is a challenging and uncomfortable process. We have to open ourselves up to new ideas and cultures, and this includes being more open to new types of people. So this is just how you would open your paragraph response. So all of these steps are segments of the same paragraph. It's not individual stuff, right? It all goes into your response for your first paragraph. And the first thing you want to do is just analyze the source. And this is going to get you some points on your rubrics, right? If you just skip this part and move on to just your critical thinking, you may struggle later on, but this first portion here, explaining the information, is just explaining to the person who's reading what you actually understand about what's being communicated. This quote is pretty straightforward. It's more of a building block to this skill of responding to these assignments. Because when you look at like 30-1 diploma assignments, the quotes can be like 4, 5, 6 sentences. They can be very long and challenging to interpret. And so your job as the writer is to break down the ideas and explain to the person reading and marking your essay that you understand what the source is trying to communicate to you. So when we move on, so after you've given a bit of an analysis of the source, just a re-examination of the source, you also want to provide some critical thinking about what the source is saying. So this is where you can provide unique insights. So I would like us to focus on these 2 statements here. Because you may or may not agree that globalization is an uncomfortable process. What's another way to think of globalization? What are other phrases or words we could use for globalization? Could interacting with other people be one? Cultural contact. Thank you, boys. We had a whole project on that. Grade 10s, hopefully you're all paying attention when your classmates were presenting, but those projects your classmates and yourselves, you all did it seem like that globalization was an easy process? No. Do you think that it's easy now? Right? So it's going to have its challenges, but here are two ways of understanding globalization. I'll actually just put this right there. So here for the critical thinking bit, this is a perspective. So this is Herbie Hancock's perspective, that we must open ourselves up to other cultures and ideas. But do we have to? Not necessarily. So here you can agree or disagree with Hancock. Also, just if they ever mention the author's name, always use their last name in your response. Don't call him Herbie. Don't call him Herb. Don't call him like Mr. Miss, the cool guy with the glasses. I think he has glasses. He does have glasses, right? Refer to them by their last name. Okay? So here you can agree or disagree with Hancock. So under your critical thinking portion, I want you to include your own perspective on these issues here. Okay, that's a great next building block for this response. So maybe you disagree. Maybe you think globalization is a comfortable process, and maybe you have an example for where globalization and cultural contact went well. Or maybe you agree with him, it's uncomfortable. And maybe you want to make a statement like, hey, globalization is an uncomfortable process. Historically, it often led to violence and loss of culture, right? Those are more pieces you can add. And it should be something that's avoided. Maybe that's your take. You need critical thinking, you need evidence, right? So that's what this is. Connect some information, case studies that we learned in class to the message of the source and your interpretation. So I'll give you a moment to write on that as well. Okay, hopefully you were able to get down a response which reflects a bit of your ability to think about the subject, and then also bring back information that you learned and tying it into the perspective of the source, which is what's necessary. Before I ask you to offer up some of what you wrote, I'll read you my response here. So what I wrote is that globalization is certainly a challenging process and an uncomfortable one. There are numerous examples in history which suggest that what Hancock is saying is true. Take, for example, the case of cultural contact between Europeans who came to Canada and their contact with indigenous tribes. This manner of globalization led to the loss of culture, life, and language of numerous indigenous tribes. This was particularly challenging due to the fact that these groups of people did not share the same language, they had different traditions, and their way of life was dramatically different. At that time, the European imperial powers that were colonizing North America did not have, or were not capable of, desire to re-examine some of their ideas, as Hancock suggests. This discomfort between two cultural groups led to the destruction and domination of one over the other. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here, grade 9s, I want you to pay attention is, I want to bring in specific keywords, reference like globalization. Oops. I'm referencing particular language that we learned. Chapter 9 is all about Indigenous and Canadian relations, so we'll learn more about that. That's why I have a bit more access to what I'm writing here. Let's see, what other, I refer to them as imperial powers. Okay, when you use keywords that we learn accurately and specifically, it improves your argument, because it suggests that you know what those words mean and how they're supposed to be used, and they're in the proper context. That's kind of your job, right? Here, I'm also kind of very vaguely, referencing the quote. Okay, this is taken right from, I'm addressing what he has said here. Re-examine some of our ideas. I'm also, in other parts, I talked about, this discomfort between two cultural groups, right? This is, again, addressing the source, which is also necessary in your response as you tie in information, right? So maybe whatever cultural group you learned about, like I think your group at the front, you did Hawaiians, you did Aztecs down there, Aztecs, right? Maybe you did Japanese. you can reference that information. You can reference information you learned from PowerPoints, wherever. Would anyone like to read out what they wrote for step 3? If you want, I can stop the recording. So I don't think it's gonna pick you up anyways, but would anyone like, is anyone interested? I wish it was this silent always when I was trying to teach. Do you, comparing what I wrote with what you wrote, do you think that you understand how to respond to this section? Yeah? Okay. Do you feel like you have enough content in your mind to respond? Let's say in the manner I did. Some of you are saying yes, some of you are saying no. Okay, so that's where those chapter questions come in, looking at the textbook. The textbook's going to give you examples. Okay, looking back at the notes, looking back at your cultural contact assignments, right? Being able to reference that material, because like what I'm doing here, like here, this is actually right here. I'm going to underline that. Here, when I say take, for example, the case of cultural contact, I'm signaling to the person reading my essay that I'm now talking about a case study. I'm referencing valid information that supports my argument, right? And so this is kind of a bridge between me trying to be critical about the quote and then me trying to provide information that helps support a perspective being taken. Did anyone kind of disagree? Or did you all more or less write about supporting the quote, supporting the perspective that Herbie Hancock takes? Did anyone kind of disagree and say, hey, I think Hancock is wrong. Like, look at this example. No? Okay. So I didn't do it in this response, but, one thing I could add and build, let's say if I wanted a really long essay, I could also, in addition, include that, hey, although historical globalization went bad, that's the focus of related issue 2, the chapters we've been covering. I could potentially add an argument that now, in the modern day and age, globalization is necessary to create an interconnected, integrated, global culture, let's say, if that's something you're interested in. Now, globalization helps us to feed ourselves better, helps us to get better access to medication, better access to information, right? So it is possible to disagree with the source, but again, you want to make sure that you're providing evidence to support your claim. You don't want to just disagree because, you got your arms crossed and you're protesting, right? We don't want to do that. Like, you need valid arguments, okay? The next step is to conclude. So if I were to just end my response right here, it's like driving a car off a cliff. I'm just presenting my ideas, my critical thinking, I'm giving an argument, and then I stop. It reads poorly in terms of mechanics. You always want to conclude. With your concluding sentences, you want to wrap up your ideas by connecting to the main point, and you should do it in 2 to 4 sentences. It doesn't need to be long and drawn out. But all your paragraphs should have concluding sentences. So take a minute here to come up with a concluding sentence where you reference the perspective you took in steps 1 and 2 and the argument you created in step 3. Summarize it in about 4 sentences max. Okay, I'm going to give you a moment to do that. Okay, let's wrap this up. So take a look at the way I understand some of you. I would like if you did share how you concluded, what you wrote. That would be excellent. I am more than comfortable going first. So again, all I wrote is, let's see, one sentence, and this is probably a carry-on sentence. Let's see. In conclusion, the perspective taken by Hancock is accurate to historical globalization. I bolded that because, again, those are key words from what we're learning. Right? The example I brought up was from history. It wasn't from modern times. Okay, boys, let's focus here. I will reemphasize what I said before. Yeah, this assignment that you're doing right now is not for marks. You'll keep this as a little demo sheet. What is for marks is your essays. Your essays are worth 30% of your final marks, so keep that in mind. Okay. Anyways, continuing. The example of European imperial powers, so again, that's bolded because those are key terms. colliding with Indigenous Canadians is one of many examples from history that show us how uncomfortable it can be to have to re-examine our ideas and to open ourselves up to different ideas and cultures. Again, I'm re-referencing the source. I'm always connecting back to the source. One thing you do not want to do in your conclusion, kids, and I emphasize, you do not want to do this, is start adding new ideas, new arguments in your conclusion. The last 2 to 4 sentences is not for new ideas like, oh man, I just thought of something. No. You should have thought about it earlier. Your conclusion is always summarizing the ideas you've already written about, right? Your step 3 here, where you provide critical information, critical thinking, that's where you bring in your ideas, your arguments, not in the conclusion. Conclusion, you just reiterate, okay? Would anyone... Please and thank you. Would anyone like to share how they concluded their paragraph? Yes, go ahead.
Globalization is it's a very uncomfortable situation for an abnormal or any kind of human or any human. As a society, we need to understand multiple perspectives and how people judge it and not make judgments like that.
I like that. That's good. Like even without knowing what the body of your paragraph was, clear. I think you likely took some evidence that said like, hey, we should be more understanding, open, and accepting of differences. Maybe that's the information you brought up. I don't know. But that wrapping up conclusion right there is very good, right? It covers all the bases you need covered. Anyone else want to share? Thank you for being courageous. Anyone else? You? No, I'm looking at you. No, she's looking away now. She's hiding. Okay. So now the last little bit here, grade 10s, is important to note. I didn't do this in the previous years, and I think this kind of confused some people. So all those individual pieces come together for one paragraph, right? I should indent that. So this is how it would look and read. A response, a paragraph in an essay. This source is communicating that globalization is a challenging and uncomfortable process. We have to open ourselves up to new ideas and cultures, and this includes being more open to new types of people. Globalization is certainly a challenging process and an uncomfortable one. There are numerous examples in history which suggest what Hancock is saying is true. Take, for example, the case of cultural contact between Europeans who came to Canada and their contact with Indigenous tribes. This manner of globalization led to the loss of culture, life, and language of numerous Indigenous tribes. This was particularly challenging due to the fact that these groups of people did not share the same language, they had different traditions, and their way of life was dramatically different. At that time, actually, I'm going to pause here. So here, I'm presenting an argument. It's not very in-depth. So this, I'll be honest, this response that I gave you likely isn't going to get above an 80%, 85%. It's very clear, it's very articulate, but it's not in depth, right? Here, you could go into something specific that caused a lot of tension, a lot of discomfort between Europeans and Indigenous people, okay? So I know you kids are starting to not pay attention. You're like, I don't know what you're doing with that bottle in your mouth. It's a bit weird. You're shaking your head as well. Keep in mind, thank you for focusing. Keep in mind, if you add some higher level thinking here and more specific examples, that is what gets you the higher marks, right? So I'm making this gesture for a reason. I'm making a point. If you make a very specific point, one of two things could happen. One is you're on point and you get the highest marks, or is you miss the point and you risk losing a lot of marks, right? But as long as you're talking about the subject in an appropriate manner, if you make a specific point, that's how you get the best marks, right? By being like if you're vague in general, like I'm doing here in the highlighted paragraph, sure, this is good enough to get you like a 65 to 75. But this bit of explanation isn't going to get you 85 and above. Okay, I just want you to know that. I want that to be clear on the video as well. At that time, the European imperial powers that were colonizing North America did not have or were not capable of a desire to re-examine some of their ideas, as Hancock suggests. This discomfort between two cultural groups led to the destruction and domination of one over the other. In conclusion, the perspective taken by Hancock is accurate to historical globalization. The example of European imperial powers colliding with Indigenous Canadians is one of many examples from history that show us how uncomfortable it can be to have to re-examine our ideas and to open ourselves up to different ideas and cultures. So let's do a final word count check on this paragraph. 227 words, not bad, right? For your own paragraphs, you might want to be around 350-ish words, maybe closer to 400 depending on how in-depth you want to get. You don't really want to go past 400 words per paragraph because you're probably rambling. So what I've done here is very short, it's very sweet, and it's good enough to get a passing mark. May not be an excellent, may not be a, wow, that was the highest mark in the class, best paragraph I read, but this covers the bases, and hopefully this activity gave you an idea of how you'll respond to images and sources when you get your essay assignment. Okay, thank you very much.